Welcome to the Echo Essentials podcast.
I'm Dave Dale.
And I'm Scott Clark. In studio with us today from Nipissing University is Dr. Stephen Arnocky. And Professor, first of all, welcome. Thanks for joining us here on the Essentials podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So we're talking about Mental Health Week. We're talking about kindness. And a study came up that you were involved with and some of the teachings that you have at Nipissing University about altruism. And we thought this might be really interesting to have a conversation about this because you've done a study on that. First of all, tell us a little bit about altruism.
Okay, well, altruism is essentially imposing any sort of cost on yourself in order to benefit another person. And so, if you're donating food at the food bank, if you're donating money to your favorite charitable organization, if you see someone's car stuck down on Main Street there in the snow and you help them dig it out, those are all altruistic acts.
Mm-hmm. And so why, as a human species, do we do this and others don't?
Well, that's the really big question, because on the surface, if you look at from an evolutionary perspective, the idea of altruism, it doesn't make a lot of sense on the surface. Why would I impose a fitness cost upon myself and my ability to survive and reproduce and pass on my genes in order to benefit another person? And so when we think of evolution, we think of things like natural selection, and we think of it as this competitive and sometimes in the animal world a gruesome process of survival. And so why on earth would you ever impose a cost upon yourself? And the early thinking on this had to do primarily with what we call kin selection, that sometimes it benefits our genes when we do nice things or beneficial things to our close genetic relatives, because a portion of our genes are still being passed on if we help those individuals survive, right? If you help your sister or your brother better survive and reproduce, well, there's a portion of your genes that are being benefited by those actions. And so there was a famous biologist who was at a bar drinking one night, and he said, something along the lines of, I would gladly lay down my life for 8 cousins or 2 brothers. And this kind of conceptualizes that idea that there's a certain tipping point where it's actually more beneficial for you to help enough closely genetically related individuals than it is to behave selfishly.
So fascinating, because I think when you tell me that, it's just a thing. I've always wondered, how people often say, family first. Family comes first, and we're going to help our family, and no matter what, we're blood. And is that a genetic thing, or is that, well, that's what my family says, but maybe another family's like, you're on your own.
Right. Well, I mean, you obviously see close family ties cross-culturally. And not only that, you see it across species as well, all sorts of different group living species. There's a great example I always give in my evolution class, it's called the Belding ground squirrel. And this is a species of squirrel where the females all stay together as genetic relatives and the males migrate out to different groups. And so whenever there's a predator around, they will alarm call. And so just based on that little bit of information, you could probably guess, well, which sex, male or female, would be more likely to do these risky alarm calls, because the individuals who do are twice as likely to be eaten by making these alarm calls.
Right.
And so you would probably guess that the females would be the ones making these alarm calls because they're with their close genetic relatives, and that is the case. And not only that, but if the group is comprised of, say, more females who have a lot of offspring or sisters in the group, they're more likely to make these alarm calls than if it's just cousins, because again, there's less genetic relatedness there among the cousins. And so good evidence that evolution and kin selection might be driving altruistic behavior.
One of the things, just before we started recording, I was saying that when I arrived here in the city back in 1991, this city really taught me, and the people in the city really taught me about being altruistic and giving back and supporting others. And at the time I was in radio, and I had this platform that I could really amplify a voice. And the reason I did it was there was some benefits. I'm listening to your story and it makes sense, but I'm thinking, well, I wasn't doing it for genetics. There was something that felt self-serving in doing things for others. I actually felt really good. It made me feel good. I built great relationships with people. I, fostered long friendships. That was to me, and you made a community better. You made individuals better. You made a community better. That's why I think I was doing it. It also helped in my radio career too, that people knew me and I built long-lasting relationships. But at the end of the day, it actually made me feel really good. So I wasn't thinking about genetics.
Exactly. I mean, this is all, of course, operating under the surface, so to speak, right? And we all have examples. I remember when I first moved here, being in the Home Depot parking lot, trying to put a bunch of construction material in the back of my vehicle, and I probably had 2 or 3 people just stop asking if I needed a hand loading it in the back. And so, we do all sorts of kind acts to people who, one, are not genetic relatives, and we'll talk more about that in a moment, but also we do it because it makes us feel good. Mm-hmm. And again, that is on the conscious level. And just like we talk about other things that are adaptive, like eating, fats and sugars, for instance, they make us feel really good when we consume those foods. We'd probably all rather eat a burger and fries than a plate of broccoli and carrots. And we feel a lot, this better feeling, the satisfied feeling when we consume those foods. And that's because ancestrally, again, these were things that were hard to come by. And so your brain needs machinery to promote and motivate you to engage in these sorts of behaviors. And I think it's the same with altruism, that if it is adaptive, if it is beneficial, if it does aid in, ultimately our genes being passed on, then that machinery is going to be there, and we're going to feel good when we engage in these behaviors.
I have a little bit of a side on that, because I got involved with the community. I wanted to be involved with the community, but my motivator was not just for myself and to feel good about doing it because you feel good. I wanted my son to have a community. So that was a sort of conscious decision. I should commit to the community. I should give to the community, and maybe they'll give back to my son. It was in the back of my mind. It wasn't, planned like that or anything, but it's like, I always thought that community was really important as an extension, and to probably benefit the genes too. Yeah.
Well, what you're talking about is reciprocity, and you've actually hit on sort of the next big wave of thinking that came. This was in the 1970s on the evolutionary understanding of altruism, which is that we engage in a lot of kind and altruistic behavior to people who are not genetic relatives. And of course, we lived ancestrally as well in small group living scenarios, but not necessarily with solely relatives. And we need ways to be able to interact and share and survive together. And so there was a famous evolutionary thinker named Robert Trivers who essentially came up with this idea of reciprocal altruism, the idea that if you do something nice for me, well, maybe down the line, I'm going to do something nice for you. I'm going to reciprocate that altruism. And if everybody is doing that, we're all better off. And they do all sorts of studies to model this, different strategies of cooperation where, if we all have $10 and we put it, they do this in the lab, they'll give, say, 4 participants $10. And okay, if you put it all in the pot, we're going to double the money. And then we'll redistribute it equally among the 4. And so if everybody puts their money in the pot, everybody benefits. But if you get one selfish person who decides that they're not going to contribute, well, they're benefiting from the extra money coming in from the pot, and they haven't spent their money. They've essentially cheated the system. And
I think you're describing the carbon tax. Okay, there, sorry.
I don't think I'm allowed to get into that. So reciprocity is a sort of a big thing in the field, and we have these implicit understandings of wanting reciprocity. We get really upset when people are gaming the system or cheating the group. We have this negative reaction to those individuals.
When you were going through this process of studying this and understanding it, what came out of it? Because I from what I understand, your study was picked up, and there was major networks that talked about it and what you're doing. What are some of the key findings that came out of this study where you went, wow, and everybody else went, wow?
Yeah. So the study that we looked at was going beyond reciprocity, because the fact is that we often behave altruistically when there are circumstances that the person is never going to be able to reciprocate, right? We donate to anonymous causes or causes where people will never be able to do anything directly beneficial back to us. And this type of altruism exists all over the world. And so there was a researcher he's at University of Guelph, Pat Barclay, who had done a study where he thought, well, maybe altruism serves as a signal of really desirable underlying qualities that might make you just a more desired interaction partner or mating partner. And the study that he did was one of those. This was back when like eHarmony was a thing, and these online dating websites where you would have a profile and a picture. And so they created an experiment where they had a man's picture, a woman's picture, and they would have a brief description of the person. And the only thing that they changed was the additional information of this person engaging in altruistic behavior. I can't remember what it was, but volunteers at a soup kitchen, we'll say. And then they looked at whether this little bit of information added to this profile that was otherwise completely the same actually improved their desirability as a dating partner to the participants. And it turns out that it did. So for both men and women, seeing that little bit of information suggesting that this person is also kind and altruistic really ramped up their long-term mating desirability. They were more interested in having a long-term relationship potentially with this person. And so for us, we wanted to know then, okay, let's extend this and see if when you look at real young adults, do those who happen to be more altruistic actually have more success in the mating domain? And so the first study that we did was just a survey-based study. They filled out a measure of their altruistic behavior. They filled out some personality measures as well, so we can control for that. And then they filled out a sexual history measure. So how easy is it for you to find desirable people that you want to date? How many sex partners have you had in the past year? These sorts of things. And what we found was that the altruists had more mating success. But the problem with that study is that it's hard to believe people when they tell you that they're altruistic, because we all think that we're altruistic, and we might be a little bit dishonest from time to time about those sorts of things. And so we wanted to do a better job with a follow-up study. So what we did in place of that self-reported altruism measure was we had participants entered into a draw. If you fill out the survey, you're going to be entered into a draw for whatever it was, a few $100s. If you win this money, do you want to donate it to one of these charitable organizations or one of your choosing, or do you want to keep the money? And the individuals who decided that they were interested in donating the money, again, had higher mating success, more long-term sex partners, casual sex partners, and the like. And there were a few sex differences here and there, but the main gist of it was that altruists seem to be more desirable. And, you know, we've sort of known this. I think we know it anecdotally that people want nice partners. The big research that was done very early on in this field was done by a guy named David Buss in the late 1980s, where they just surveyed people from, I think it was over 37 different cultures about what people look for in a mate. And the big thing that got picked up from his research was the sex differences in preferences for attractiveness and status. Men care more about having an attractive female partner, females care more about status. But lost in all of this was the finding that, everybody just cares the most about having a nice, kind, pleasant partner who's going to treat them well. And, that doesn't get a lot of media attention, but it's probably pretty obvious to us, but
it makes complete sense actually when you say it. That's not a real surprise, but it's funny how we put on different hats at different times to be different things because we think that's going to be attractive to others. So you said it quickly, but is it so? Are men more attracted to women if women are altruistic, and vice versa?
And vice versa, for long term. Yes. Now the results were a little bit more conflicted when you look at the dating profile study, the experiment that they did there. The results were clear for long-term mating. They were less clear for short-term mating. And again, maybe that makes sense because you really want an altruistic partner who's going to treat you well in a long-term mating context, a marriage partner, for instance. Short-term mating, maybe it doesn't matter quite as much.
So when I was doing a little bit of research before you came in, just about understanding altruism, I came across a piece in religion. And how does religion factor into this, or doesn't it? Because I look at, when you looked at, it showed many religions, and I would think religions are altruistic. They're I would think most they give back, or they help community and things like that. They had Buddhism was at the top for altruistic. I'm just wondering, was that in anything of your in your studies?
No, you know what? We've never really...
The golden rule.
Yeah, that's right. You're right. Most religious teachings, I mean, I'm no expert, but most religious teachings seem to revolve a lot around community and giving back and helping others. We've never looked at that in terms of, someone's religious affiliations and their altruistic tendencies, but that might be something for some future research.
Yeah, treat others how you want them to treat you.
Right.
That's sometimes when you're given to somebody that's begging on the street or something like that. For those who have been near that line, they think, well, maybe if I end up in that spot, I'd like somebody to give back to me too.
But the part I find interesting about religion and all of this is, like, I have friends of different religions, and there's some that feel like they're the altruistic ones and others aren't. You know what I mean? So it's, they're not altruistic, but we are. And so there's differing opinions. There's so much juxtaposition in religion, but we won't go down that path.
You already did.
I sort of did. So as part of your study, when we're looking at the notes, it talked about altruism and sex and why people go home from a bar with a mate and why they don't, and that could be tied to competitiveness, or tell us a little bit about that.
Well, that's when the women will, I excuse the term, but blocking, right?
They'll block someone from going home with someone else?
Yeah, well, they volunteer to take someone home just to so that they don't get that person, right? Is that how I read that?
So this...
Is that how that works? I was never good at that. I had 2 girlfriends and married them both. So
okay. Well, this was a study that we looked at. It was an idea that some students in my lab about a decade ago had, where we wanted to look at whether behaviors that maybe on the surface might seem altruistic might actually be rooted in competitive intentions. And so we colloquially in the lab, they called it the wingman study, because we were looking at, young university age students' willingness to either, help their friends find mates, in a bar context or any other context, versus preventing their friends from, meeting new people at a bar and maybe going home with them or whatever the case may be. And so with this study, what we wanted to look at was whether or not the behavior of, say, stopping your friend from going home with someone was rooted in altruism because you're acting protective. You want to keep this undesirable person away from your friend or from taking advantage of them, or whether it was actually potentially rooted in competitiveness. And so we had participants complete measures of these sorts of behaviors. We had them complete measures of altruism and reciprocity, as well as competitive measures such as, we call it intrasexual competitiveness. So being very hyper competitive, especially in the mating domain, toward members of your sex. And what we found was that in this sort of hookup type of context, that it was intrasexual competitiveness that really seemed to be driving those sort of preventative behaviors. And so, it just kind of goes to show that behaviors that could be sold as altruistic or might appear altruistic on the surface are not always necessarily altruistic. The other thing is that we sometimes engage in behaviors that look altruistic that are very low cost. Again, it's more of a signaling thing along the lines of how we were talking about with our other study, that altruism might signal underlying qualities. I have a lot of resources. I'm generous and willing to share those resources. I have status, and so I can afford to give this helping hand or to donate this money. But you can also look at things that appear to be altruistic that may be a little bit more self-serving. And I always use the ice bucket challenge as a really good example. So this was, if you remember, I don't know if it was 8 or 9 years ago now, it was it was viral. And everybody was doing this ice bucket challenge in support of ALS. And there was research that showed that only 1 in 10 people who did the ice bucket challenge and posted to social media actually donated anything to ALS research, which was the whole purpose of the project. And so you see all this discourse about, well, is it enough that you're just generating awareness and spreading the word, or should you actually be engaging in more meaningful behavior if you're going to support these sorts of causes? And so you see it on social media a lot, people changing their profile picture to reflect, whatever cause of the day they're interested in. But beyond that, are they doing anything meaningful, or is it, more of a signaling thing?
So let's talk about the university setting for a second. I had a chance, and it was only a brief time, but I was able to have a coffee with the former chancellor of Nipissing University, Dr. Dellandrea. And it was right around the time when the library was built, the Michaelis Learning Library was built. And he was teaching me about how people give and why people give in large quantities of money. So the Schulich School of Education. So, and he knew the Schulich family, and Seymour Schulich, I think it is the gentleman's name. And he said, Scott, I never ask anybody for money. He says, never ever ask anybody for money. I just line 2 people up with things that they care about, and they naturally give. So I'm wondering, like in a university setting, there's so much giving. There's names on all sorts of buildings. Is that altruistic, or is that self-serving?
I would think it's one of those questions. I always err on the side of it's altruism, because I imagine that the people donating are passionate about the cause that they're donating to, that it makes them feel good, that they believe, and most often they usually are doing good with their altruistic behavior. If it's a financial donation, they're helping people. They're not doing it as a self-serving nature, even though, it might actually be beneficial. Bill and Melinda Gates, if they're giving X number of billions of dollars, well, do they ultimately benefit more from being known as these wonderful philanthropists, or the alternative, buying a 10th Ferrari or whatever they're doing with their money? And so I think that there's no reason why it can't be both, why it can't be evolution from an evolutionary perspective, beneficial to the individual, but at the same time, be truly altruistic.
Yeah, it's because I don't know, and I'm ready to be corrected here, but I don't know if Seymour Schulich has ever been to Nipissing University. He may or may not. I don't know if he has, But there's someone who's given, I don't know, was it $12, $16 million, some huge amount of money to the School of Education at Nipissing, like, and probably doesn't have to. Like,
No,
he doesn't
not
need
at all. Doesn't
profile
have
in the Nipissing region. I wouldn't think.
How did he make his money? Do you know?
I think it was through finance. He made it
so
through.
he just feels guilty then.
No, but he has Schulich School of Business down in Toronto. Like, he's tied to many, many different universities.
capitalist.
Yeah. And has given back.
Yeah.
And he feels guilty?
I guess there's different
don't
levels.
think so.
No, I'm just saying there's different motivators of altruism, right? And different types of altruism. Some might be more pure than others. That's all.
Yeah, and reputation is a big thing tied to altruism. We see it again, like from my perspective, I'm always interested in, whether we see it in other species too, as opposed to only in humans. And there's a lot of really cool work on the reputational effects of altruism or the reputational effects of not being altruistic as well. And so some cool ones that I always, again, talk about in my class, there's one in vampire bats where these bats, the females do most of the feeding. So they fly out at night, from the cave and, gorge on the blood of cattle or whatever it is. And then they come back. And the cool thing about this species is they don't necessarily always just feed their own offspring. They feed close genetic relatives' offspring, but they also feed just their friends' offspring. And so experimenters have cleverly sort of manipulated this to say, well, what happens if we make it so that one of these female bats is cheating the system, kind of gaming the system? Can we affect her reputation? And so they'll do it in different ways. I think they've done it where they capture her so she can't feed on the cattle and then can't subsequently feed offspring. I think they've done it as well where they fill the blood sac with air somehow so that she constantly has this, what looks like a full blood sac. And so the other bats are seeing this and saying, oh, she's cheating the system. She's not feeding our young. And you can probably guess what happens at this point is these bats will stop feeding her young. And so you'll have all of this tracking of who is behaving altruistically and who is gaming the system. You see it in birds as well. There's a species called the pied flycatcher bird. And these researchers come up with these very clever designs where they'll take these pie catchers who nest kind of somewhat near each other, and they usually live in pairs, and they'll put an owl near one of the nests. And usually what these birds will do is they'll all gang up and they'll do this behavior called mobbing behavior where they harass and attack the predator. And so what happens if you take one of those couples, one of those pairs, and you capture them temporarily so you don't allow them to engage in this communal protective behavior. You put an owl near one of the nests, and obviously the pair that are most threatened are going to go and attack this fake plastic owl or whatever it is. And the other nearby nest will also come in and help, but the captured ones can't. And so then what you do after that is you put an owl, after you release the captured group, you put an owl near the captured group's nest, and you put an owl near what was the other helper group. And then you look at the original group of two birds, and you see, okay, now they have to go help one of these pairs. Who are they going to go help? They go back and help the group that came to help them previously. And so again, you have this tracking of who has helped me before and reputation that determines your subsequent behavior back to these individuals. And we see reputational effects in humans as well. Again, this has been shown in all sorts of studies where you have people engaging in a task and then you have an observer and you tell people, okay, you're going to engage in this monetary lab-based task where you can cooperate or you can cheat someone, but you're going to be watched and you're going to engage in a subsequent monetary task with the person who's watching you. And as soon as you introduce that observer effect and that likelihood of now you're earning a reputation, people cooperate way more. So it's really interesting that reputation is a big driver of our altruistic behavior or of our avoidance of cheating behavior.
Do you find it, because I find it fascinating when you tell a story about, human behavior and why we're altruistic. And a lot of it makes total sense to me, why and the evolution of why that takes place. But when you tell me about wildlife and the bat story, for instance, I find that incredibly fascinating. Does the wildlife world fascinate you more when they're altruistic? Because I don't know if that's genetic it is genetic, right? They're helping each other survive, and
it seems to be the commitment to community is the underlying thing. If you're committed to the community, community is committed to you.
It seems simple enough, right? Is there a community? Is there a society? Is there a country like that you've seen in studies where you go, well, in northern Norway, there's this community that they're altruistic every day? And
not particularly. I mean, a lot of researchers will look at like subsistence-based societies to the extent that they exist now. Most have unfortunately been touched by the Western world in some ways, but a lot of researchers will look at hunter-horticulturalist groups and these sorts of things, and they'll look at meat sharing, for instance. And okay, if you're hunting larger game, it might be rarer that you have a successful hunt, and then all of a sudden you've got this excessive amount of meat that you can't possibly preserve and keep for yourself for long enough. And so do individuals who have more of a propensity to, for instance, share that meat after they've successfully hunted, do they gain higher status? Do they gain, it's usually the males, so do they gain more wives? Do they have more care of their offspring? Do they garner more support in their conflicts within the group and these sorts of things? And usually that is the case, right? If you are altruistic, again, even in societies that look sometimes extraordinarily different from ours, you see the same fundamental facts that altruistic behavior is beneficial, that people like and side with and support people who are kind and generous, and that seems to be a human universal.
Yeah, you sort of see that in indigenous communities around here. Actually, the tradition of doing that is still alive, or it's been reintroduced and fortified post-colonial disruption, where like there's a meat locker kind of thing happening in Nipissing First Nation, where some of the hunters donate, right? And they go out specifically to get a moose for those who can't. And whether or not they gain reputational advantage with that, or whether that's just part of how their community, wants to be, right? So, yeah, there is some examples of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, you're not engaging in these behaviors thinking that, I'm going to gain a reputational advantage, or I'm going to gain a new mate, or anything along these lines.
Well, maybe some. I know some guys. Right?
We're for the most part, we're doing these behaviors because it's the right thing to do. We think it's the right thing to do. It makes us feel good to do these things. But the reason the behavior exists, at least from an evolutionary perspective, and the reason that machinery exists in our brains is because, again, it has ultimately benefits to the individual's genetic fitness as well.
I was going to jump in when you had said about the First Nation community and Nipissing First Nation. I remember when we started working with the fishery group, and there was a lot of tension in the community between the professional fishermen and the weekend warrior fishermen, right? And so M&R, I guess through the 90s, were like ticketing professional fishermen, right? And they had the right to fish on their lake. And it went nowhere. But it was when, the community set their own guidelines on fishing, if someone fell outside those guidelines, they would bring them into the justice circle. And they explained the justice circle to me that it encompassed, from elders to youth to everybody in the community. And when someone was fishing where they shouldn't have been fishing or doing something, the justice circle would say, look, you're going to take that fish, you're going to clean the fish, and in 2 weekends there's a big wedding happening, you're going to provide all the fish for that wedding. So the justice circle was about giving back to the community with what you've been doing, but it wasn't like a shame-based thing. It was more of like, you need to do this for the community to heal the community for what you're doing.
A teaching moment, yeah.
Yeah, and it was like, boy, that feels super healthy compared to how we conduct justice. It felt very, very different.
It does. It sounds fantastic, and it just highlights also how sensitive we are to the reputational effects of our behavior, right? And there's one final study that kind of jumps to mind that I think underscores this point where, and it was done in a psychology department. So you know how in universities sometimes they'll have these little break rooms, and the department will put a Keurig or some little coffee pod set up. So there was a university, I believe it was in the UK, where they had this sort of thing, and they had the coffee pods, and it was, you know, X amount of cents for a coffee and a little bit for the milk, and it was on the honor system. So if you have a coffee, you throw the money in the pot. And what the researchers found was that nobody was putting the money in the pot. Everyone's just these cheap psychology professors taking the coffee without putting the appropriate amount of money in. So what these researchers did was right above the coffee station, they alternated every week. They would put just a picture of eyes, just a printed out black and white picture of eyes above this coffee station, and they would alternate it. So 1 week would be eyes, 1 week would be flowers. That was their control, and back and forth, and they would look at the amount of money in the little communal pot relative to what had been taken. And what they found was just that little indication of the eyes, even though it's clearly not a real person watching you, was enough to increase the amount of money being given to the communal pot. And so we're so sensitive to the reputational effects of our cheating behavior in this case, that little cue is enough to promote, you know, more beneficial behavior to the group.
Did social media, or does social media play into this in any way?
Like in terms of having a bigger audience of people
having a
watching
bigger
you?
audience. Well, I see it's if I'm sometimes scrolling through TikTok, you'll see like someone being altruistic. You know, it's sort of like these gotcha moments where someone's like, I've seen it many times. The setup is they go somewhere and it's like, hey, I don't have money to buy this. Do you have? Oh yeah, I'd buy that for you. And then as soon as you buy it, then they turn around and give you $1,000 or $10,000 or for being altruistic, right?
Yeah. Well, I think those videos are really popular. There are a lot of people doing that I've seen them. Yeah, you see them on TikTok or Facebook or whatever the case is. I wonder about the fact that those are popular videos. It just speaks to, I think, again, how it's almost like anecdotal evidence that we are sensitive and interested in how people treat each other, the reputational effects, and you know, the ultimate benefits of kindness. So yeah, those are interesting videos for sure.
So is there anything in your study or that you wanted to talk about today that maybe we didn't touch on that, or did you cover most of it?
No, I think we've really covered it. The one big thing for us, I think, in psychology as a field is that, you know, we tend to think of psychology as like a focus on the negative a lot of times, where we're focused on obviously mental health conditions and disorders on the psychopathology side, but even in the way that we study how people interact. You know, a lot of the research is on violence or aggression, or even in relationships, which is what I primarily study. You've got, you know, jealousy and cheating behavior or domestic violence and these sorts of things. And there's really, I think, still an underrepresentation of research on the positive side of human behavior. And I'm not quite sure why that is the case. I don't know if it's just that psychologists are really interested in trying to understand and help with the negative side of humanity. And so we neglect the positive side a little bit. But hopefully, I think this research and the research of a lot of other folks working in this field helps to underscore the need for a better understanding of positive behavior as well.
I got a question that might get you fired. Is there a difference between the biological sexes as far as altruism in the pure state of?
In terms of engaging in the behavior, there's nothing that I am aware of. I think in the certain acts of altruism that individuals will do, if you look at, again, like subsistence-based societies, well, men are doing the hunting, and so they, of course, would be the ones sharing the meat that they've hunted. So you'll see those sort of just naturally occurring differences in the types of altruistic behavior, but I'm not really aware of any overarching differences between males and females in the type of, or in the amount of altruistic behavior that they engage in. I know There's research on sex differences in contemporary society as well. Again, more from a signaling perspective. There was a study that came out, for instance, where they looked at online donations to it was a UK-based study, but it was essentially one of those websites where you can put your cause and try and raise donations for the cause. And you can put a profile picture. And the researchers found that if the profile picture was of an attractive female doing the money raising, that men would be more likely to donate. And this was compounded by the fact that if another donator with a male sounding name, so presumably a male, made a larger than average donation, then subsequently males were more likely to donate more money in a competitively altruistic manner, just based on this prompt of an attractive female being the person organizing the donation website. Yeah. And then you'll see it in the lab as well. There's been studies on competitive altruism where you make groups of like all males or all females or mixed groups, and you have one person where they have to volunteer. The group has to have somebody volunteer to engage in something painful, like a cold stressor task, where they put your hand for an extended period of time in really freezing cold ice water. It is extraordinarily painful, and these researchers will show that males will often, in the presence of females in the group, be more likely to compete with one another to be the person to go undergo this challenging task. And so you see some sex differences there, but other than that, both males and females benefit certainly from behaving altruistically and kindly to one another. And that, I think, ties back to that David Buss research on mate preferences. What are you looking for in a partner? It's the same thing for interaction partners too. We want to associate with people who are nice to us, kind, generous, easy to get along with, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's in my time in being involved with a number of different charities and volunteer groups, I've always been amazed that, of course, there's, some real leadership when it comes to like the Seymour Schulich. They'll come to the table with $12 million to get things rolling and things like that. I've found over time that I'm absolutely inspired by people who you just sort of know, we're in a small community, you just sort of know that they don't have a lot to give and they're given to the max, right? And you go, wow, that's impressive. The altruistic spirit of that, like they're really, how I guess you put it, suffering more than where Seymour Schulich, I guess, is a multi-billionaire, where probably $10 million is like, $1,000 to him, right? Or $1,000 to us or something.
Right. So you're saying almost the reputational effects of someone with less to give, they're giving proportionally more, and it's more costly to them to do it, is more impressive, right? Which I think,
to me, yeah,
I think makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of I always show a clip of Curb Your Enthusiasm with Larry David on in my class when we're talking about donating. There's an episode in an early season where he donates like a wing to a charitable organization, and then Ted Danson, who's his nemesis on this show, has also donated a wing, but he's done it anonymously. But then Ted Danson has gone around and told everybody that he was anonymous, and Larry is extraordinarily unhappy about this. And again, it's just the interesting dynamics of the reputational consequences of our
brilliant
behaviors.
stuff. It must be for you, even as a psychologist, and that's what you study. And when you watch like Curb Your Enthusiasm, these incredible insights that comics have,
it jumps
on
out
human
at you.
nature.
Yeah, it does. It jumps out at you, and then obviously you want to capture those and be able to use them as teaching tools as well, because people, I think, are more engaged when you can use clips like that and humor. And
how does it land with the students? What is the feedback you hear back from the students when you teach this?
I think that it's always it's a unique. My course, Evolutionary Psychology, is a unique perspective within the field of psychology. So I think a lot of courses are very much focused on, say, social influences on our behavior, on our psychology, on our well-being. And so being able to apply more of a biological understanding to the way that we think, feel, and behave is a unique perspective for them. I think that they enjoy it and appreciate it. It's a different perspective on some of these core common things that we study in psychology. And then I know before we came on air, we were talking about a student question that I get almost every year, which is, well, if altruism is somewhat self-serving, at least at the genetic basis, then does it really exist? And that's a bit more of a deeper philosophical sort of question, but I always tell them I think it does. And at the end of the day, if we feel like we're doing something good for other individuals, then that's altruism.
Right. Dr. Stephen Arnocky is with Nipissing University and teaches there and is doing some great work with the students. We want to thank you very much for coming in today and teaching us a little bit about what you're studying.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Knowing more about kindness. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Scott Clark.
And I'm Dave Dale.
Thanks for tuning in and locking in with the Essentials Podcast, Echo Essentials Podcast.